Okay, first of all, Professor Gao, I want to mention that it's a complete honor to have you on our show. Everyone knows you on our channel, and from where I come from, you are a hero. Pakistanis acknowledge your honesty in intellectual honesty and also the bravery that combines with your intellectual honesty. Sir, with great honor and pleasure, welcome to our show, Professor Victor Gao. How are you?
Thank you very much. I'm fine. Greetings to you and greetings to your audience. I consider myself as an ironclad friend and brother of the Pakistani people. So it's a great honor to be on your show.
Thank you, sir. Sir, because we had a lot of time to research on this, if you can get a brief note of your early life and your education and how you got here.
I was born in 1962 in a city called Suzhou, very close to Shanghai. I went to college in my hometown, Suzhou University. Then I went to Beijing University of Foreign Studies, and both my majors were in English language and literature. Afterwards, I joined the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and I became a government English interpreter. I had the great honor of working with Deng Xiaoping and other government and party leaders in the 1980s. I also had a unique pleasure of traveling to Islamabad with the Chinese delegation and talked to the Pakistani side for the signing of the protocol, which led to the opening of the Hongqilapu mountain pass. And we were received by His Excellency President Ziaul Haq. I also had the great honor of working for the visiting Pakistani foreign minister, I think in 1987. And that's the beginning of my goodwill towards the Pakistani people. Later, I worked with the United Nations Secretariat in New York before I went on a 4 year study at Yale, including the first year when I was enrolled in a PhD program on political science, and the subsequent 3 years when I studied law, eventually getting a Juris Doctorate degree from Yale Law School. Then I worked as a lawyer in New York, practiced investment banking with Morgan Stanley, worked with Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission as a regulator, and then I worked with a bunch of other distinguished companies. Eventually, I ended up as general counsel for a major oil company called the China National Offshore Oil Company, which is one of the three largest oil companies in China. And then I also doubled up as the general secretary of the China Private Equity Association, which engaged in private equity practice as well as regulations in China. And over the more recent years, I've been very actively engaged in advisory jobs for many major companies in China and internationally. And I also enjoyed giving my opinion on major issues in the world, including China's position, China's relations with the rest of the world. So that brought me to 2025, when I had the great honor of being with you on your distinguished show.
Thank you, sir. Sir, as you mentioned that you had a chance of working as an interpreter in these elite groups, we want to have an idea, just give us an idea how these meetings work when two big elites meet with each other. How is the meeting environment? How much depends on that moment, on the personalities at that time, and how much homework is usually done? Because being an interpreter is like being very, very close, in fact, being in the middle of everything. So just give us a little window into this. How was it interacting with all these leaders while being in between?
Well, being a top interpreter, especially in China for top leaders like Deng Xiaoping, is a rare opportunity. And you really cannot expect to get it. When it became yours, it became so historical, so momentous. I think several requirements are very obvious: confidentiality, and you need to have the trust of the people you interpret for, and also a very high level of excellence in both English as well as in Chinese, and also a vast knowledge base about almost everything which may be covered in the conversation, and always an over eagerness to learn, to explore new things, and never be complacent about anything that may happen in the course of interpretation. I think one of the great advantage and privilege of being a top English interpreter is exactly as you mentioned. You are in the middle of something very important. For example, in the 1980s, when China and the United States were still very much engaged for mutual cooperation in multiple areas, including in military and otherwise, for example. And most of the discussions were off the record, private and confidential. And some of these discussions had subsequent repercussions, even up to today. For example, at that time, there was the war between Iran and Iraq. The United States, interestingly, supported uh, Saddam Hussein against the Iranian government, whereas China was very much balanced between Iran at the time and Iraq at the time and refused to take sides. The United States urged China to support Iraq against Iran, and China always refused to do that. I think China did the right thing, whereas the United States, in subsequent years, overthrew President Saddam of Iraq, and they had the first Iraqi war, the second Iraqi war. Then they were on hostile terms with Iran, for example. So the United States made many changes over the years, whereas China has always been steady and consistent in its foreign policy about Iraq and Iran, and in more subsequent years about Saudi Arabia. So I think based on my personal experience and involvement in some of these very high level, very complicated and high stake diplomatic encounters, I'm firmly believe that China is a major force for peace and stability. And the United States has always been kind of capricious or frivolous, constantly changing, and they seem to be urged on the spur of the moment, whereas China is always casting its eye on the longer term, for example, in terms of 100 years, if not even longer. So I think I learned a lot, and I really enriched myself tremendously working with Deng Xiaoping. And I worked for more than 20 of his very important meetings with incoming English speaking global leaders, mostly from the United States, of course, but also from many other countries, including, as I mentioned, the leader in Pakistan, the visiting president from Bangladesh, and the prime minister from Australia, from New Zealand. And I also accompanied quite a few top Chinese leaders on major overseas trips to countries in America, in Europe, in Oceania, you name it. So I think a lot of what you know about Victor Gao had its foundation in the 1980s when I was with the Chinese Foreign Service as a top English interpreter.
So, when you look back on in those days, any incident that always pops up to in your head that makes you smile during your interpreting days, anything that you would want to share with our audience?
Well, there are so many things or anecdotes. Some would make you smile, as you mentioned. Some may make you weep or cry. Very much touching, for example. I don't think we have enough time to go over the details. But I think one thing is very important. I remember the visiting Secretary of State, George Shultz from the United States. He worked as Secretary of State for President Ronald Reagan, and he kept talking about, China should change its policy about Cuba, and the United States would be happy to coordinate its position vis-a-vis Vietnam. And for paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, he basically brushed him off by saying China's position regarding Cuba is well known. Your next question, please. He didn't even bother a second arguing or debating with visiting Secretary of State George Shultz about what China need to do with regard to Cuba. It's always a decision that China need to make rather than a decision the United States need to make and impose on China. Now, you mentioned some of these historical encounters. I had the great honor to work for former President Richard Nixon back in 1985 during one of his visits to China. And the Chinese government, according to its own tradition, provided a special plane for former President Nixon. So we had time to travel to Beijing and Xi'an and Xiamen and also Guangzhou. So I had about 7 full days working with former President Nixon, interpreting for him, and traveling to quite a few important cities in China. I think I gained a deep understanding of Richard Nixon as a person, Richard Nixon as a former president, and I also talked with him, shared comments with him, and picked his brain on what drove him to send Dr. Henry Kissinger on the top secret visit to China via, among other things, Islamabad. So Pakistan played a very important intermediary role, bringing China and the United States together. And what really drove him to reaching out to China and establishing official relations between China and the United States. Now, I say this because I benefited hugely from the insights and the personal conversations with these global leaders, and the consequence of such discussions not only just happened back in 1985, they continue to impress me till today, because as a result of my foreign ministry experience, as well as my subsequent educational and working experience, I have known all the US presidents or former presidents since Nixon, with 2 exceptions. I've never met with former President Gerald Ford, but he graduated from Yale Law School, so we were alumni with each other. And I corresponded with President Ford, even though we never met. Now, the other one is President Donald Trump. I've never met him. Whether I want to meet him or not, that's another issue. So I think the fact that I've met with all these presidents when they were either incumbent president or former president in different capacities, of course, since President Nixon, really gives me enough solid information when I talk about the United States as a country, talk about the US government as a political system, talk about President Donald Trump as a president, or the more recent President Biden. We met him in the 1980s when he was a Senate Democratic leader. At that time, he was nowhere near the very top of the US leadership, but that gave me the first impression of Joe Biden, and it led to subsequently he becoming a vice president for 8 years and president of the United States for 4 years. Now, the advantage for me is that based on all these personal encounters and relations with different leaders in China, in the United States, elsewhere, in many other countries, and also based on my very intense reading and studying and very high level of education at Yale, for example, especially at Yale Law School, I think I'm a person in the know, and I always want to update my knowledge base about what's happening in the world, including, for example, about the ironclad brotherhood between China and Pakistan, as well as the need to build peace and stability on the Indian subcontinent, and the absolute necessity of stopping any country to weaponize water in the Indus River, for example. And I think I never make a comment out of the blue or in a vacuum. I always put a comment of mine in a historical context, meaning I have tremendous amount of responsibility when I make a comment in the public media, because the worst I can do is to mislead anyone or any country. And the best I can do is to make a positive impact, either by clarifying a particular issue or explaining a particular issue for different audiences with the aim of building up peace and opposing war.